Max, I am so happy to have you here um, on the Casually Profound series in the Size Eyes podcast. The wonderful Joko Library, right? I think we were just talking before you started recording about how this room is probably one of the best ones to create content and just a vibe in general. So appreciate you taking some time out of your week to have a casually profound convo.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate any opportunity to come back out to the library, anyways. But yeah, it's just really great having a good conversation with you.
Yeah. Just for everyone listening, we met less than a year ago because I moved back to Kansas City in like Labor Day
Oh,
weekend
okay.
last year. So, and then we met at Keystone Innovation District,
Hmm.
like in the fall, probably October-ish or so, October, November, probably sometime in there last year. Um,
Was it at the Waywell Project or was it at a session? I'm trying to remember.
I feel like the first time was at a Weibo,
Was it okay?
and then over time, I think we
You
just,
just the
yeah,
sessions of things.
yeah, just kind of everything over there just kind of
Yeah, it all
intersects
blends. Yeah.
in a good way, and that's
Right, because the Waylo project also does sessions too, every so often. So you're like, where did
yeah. But I'd love to start off with gratitude. So is
Mm.
there anything that comes to mind that you want to express and share your gratitude for?
Oh, so when you asked me this, I was like going to be like libraries because if you tried to, we actually had a conversation about this at Keystone, not I think specifically with you, but with somebody else um, yesterday at the Keystone Innovation District. If you tried to pitch the concept of libraries in the 2024, people will be like, there's no way. It's like you just give books away for free and then you bring them back and you have this community center. So that part of me wants to go there, but it's also, I think, it being June, I think, and it being Pride Month, and I think it's also just like the gratitude of the people who have the queer elders who've come before us as well. So it's kind of like I wanted to do the easy way, but also just I try to think about that kind of legacy that June is really all about celebrating. So
Yeah, love that, Max. Yeah, on my end, I'm also grateful for libraries and books and everything. And let's see, I'm grateful for being able to like I say people, but like in specifically the connections and community that I've made
mm,
and created around me. It's awesome to see. Like I was making a list the other day in this notebook about about people that I've met,
mm,
or just people in my life in general, that I would say my network, and it was it's like let's say 50 people on that page, and 40 of them, if I saw those words last year at this point, I'd be like, what? Who are these people?
right.
Right. And so it's like crazy to see the amount of people that I've met in the last like less than a year or so, just moving back to Kansas City and putting myself out there.
And just to speak to that really quickly, when you said you moved here back last Labor Day, I was like, you haven't even been like I was very surprised for a second. I'm like, you've only been here a year. It feels like you've been like in the community for longer than that. So I was like, oh, that's just how present and how much you kind of engage. I think it's just like Sai's always been here.
It feels like that.
I can't
Yeah.
I can't recall a time before. It's like how it is, but yeah, so that was just surprising for a second. And then when you talked about how you engage in the, I'm like, see, that's why it just feels like you were meant to be here. You're going to be here.
Appreciate that.
So
Appreciate it. And then same for you. Same goes back to for you and the way that you get involved. Um, but yeah, with that gratitude mindset, I'll have to do like a quick visualization. Um, and
am I supposed to shut my eyes? Right?
you can. That's what I do.
Okay.
If you're comfortable with it, you can. If not, no worries at all. We can take some deep breaths and relax fully into our seats. Just taking some deep breaths in and out. Getting more and more relaxed. Feeling relaxed physically, our head, our neck, shoulders, our torso, our hips, our legs, knees, and all the way down to our toes. Feeling fully relaxed. And from the space, let's imagine at the end of this conversation, we exchanged some of the best energy, some of the best ideas, our feelings, our emotions, our thoughts, and ultimately, we're our true selves. Just soaking in that moment and feeling for a quick second. And whenever we're ready, we can come back to the present moment in this beautiful Johnson County Library. First question, Max, that I have for you is, who do others think Max Sheffield is?
Oh my gosh. I guess so. I guess it depends on who you ask, because I, as a kid, I was definitely that, or even as a teenager, that arrogant brat who knew everything and you couldn't tell me anything because I had an answer for all of it. And you can probably already see that there is still some of that inside, like that's not, but, there's also, that part of me who is still in that survival mode. I've had some experiences with trauma. So there's some people who can attest to the fact that some of my own behaviors and actions were coming from that hurt place. So there's people who probably will tell you that I'm a huge bitch and I'm this and I'm that, But I think in general, if you were to ask anybody, Max Sheffield is 100% themselves. I didn't really realize that, this is going to sound arrogant. I already said that there's some of that in me, but like when you talked about how, like, even with me, it's like I've always been there in the community. I think that I did not believe that at all until last November at Global Entrepreneurship Week. I've been doing like workshops for GEW the last couple of years, but there were people who I don't know who were like, Max, and they were coming up to me and talking to me like we knew each other. And as somebody who's not great with like names, I'm like, you have that embarrassing moment of like, I hope somebody says their name so I can act like I knew it all along. And luckily nothing came up or like put me on the spot. But, so like people, I wear myself, my emotions, my values, my personality 100% on my sleeve. There's no doubts of what I believe, what I think, what I enjoy. Like I'm just fully that person. And it took a long time. I'm 33. It probably has taken me 3 decades or more to be able to fully live that. But I do like that people feel like they know me, because it only takes like a couple of days to be like, okay, yes, this is, I'm neurodivergent. I have high energy. That's actually why I chose the name Max for myself, because, I'm gender fluid. So I chose this name. I'm like, everything I do is the max, is to the max, like the whole 90s retro, like skater, like to the max. Yeah. that's just my personality. I just cannot help it, So I think that people do see that in myself, but I also want to throw that there's the negatives to that too, right? Because sometimes, in being that wildly passionate, I think I do sometimes have that tendency to just bulldozer over like other people completely unintentionally. It's really not the design. I'm just so enthusiastic that it's like, oh, other people have other things to bring to the table too, so
Yeah.
so yeah, I think that's probably the best way I think to describe it.
Yeah, I didn't know that about your name, about like, I guess one of the reasons behind it is to like to personify the maximum of whatever, like the
Yes.
personality, the values, etc.
Yeah. So what's interesting about being able to choose your name is like, I think names should give you an idea of just like a brand name, right? Like, because I'm in the marketing world, a brand name should tell you what something is about, right? And I think that can be true of people as well. And a lot of transgender people like belabor their names. I literally was sitting on my couch, like my partner at the time was watching TV, and I just Googled unisex names, like names that work for men and women. And I think one of the first couple of articles included the name Max. And I'm like, you know what? Maxine, Maxwell, Maximilian, like there's lots of ways Max is shortened. I'm like, that's for me. I was like, just like I am in, as a personality, once I decide on something, I'm like, that's it. Okay, made that decision, time to keep going. My whole name, so it's kind of interesting because you're right. It's like personified, like even the decision to change my name or to go by a different name was just how I am as a person. Just like, yep, that's it.
I love that. That's very fitting, right? It's very meta, and like, yeah, and it's interesting, yeah, because like we don't, like, when we're born, like we don't get to choose our names,
right?
And so, but I have noticed, for me, like a lot of people have names that end up being representative of who they are, or maybe vice versa.
Like a chicken or the egg type of scenario.
Right, yeah.
The name, yeah. Yeah.
So I guess going to, well, you mentioned one of the things about like you're fully yourself, like your personality, values, etc. Would love to hear more about like what those values are for yourself.
So we spoke to it a little bit already, but for me, that authenticity, I think in our social media saturated world, I think that authenticity is just one thing that it's hard because there's a lot, like, you don't want to necessarily put all of your dirty laundry out there, but like just be like, again, who I am. And you've seen some of the marketing that I've done. Who I am in social media and is the same as it is off. That is 100%. So there's that aspect to it. But for me, there's also community. You can tell I'm just, I'm the type of person that is always present in the community. How can I give back to my community? How can I make it feel, how can I personally help us all succeed collectively? Which is why, again, I go to the Waitlist Project, because I think that is part of their ethos too, right? Of like, we can all succeed collectively. Like any sort of positive change, or systemic change, it is going to have to happen collectively. There's not one person who's going to come and like save us. We all as a community need to be making our actions, reflect that. And one of my favorite quotes, it's James Clear, who wrote Atomic Habits. I don't know if he wrote it in the book, but he definitely said this in a podcast, which we're going meta because this is going to be on a podcast. Yeah. But he said something that I think about all the time. He says, the actions you take daily are a vote towards the person that you are. And I think about that all the time. I'm like, am I is this the vote that I want to cast for the person I want to be? So that I think from that community perspective. But again, we talked a little bit about some of the trauma that I've dealt with, but autonomy is so important to me. I've had some domestic violence and abuse in my past, and there were a lot of times where I really was not in control in any way. And even from a lesser extent, even being an employee, I was told, I had to be in the closet. I had to do this. I couldn't talk about this, um, couldn't wear your hair a certain way, like all of these different things. And I know that employment doesn't sound like it's as bad as, an abuser who gets to tell you when you can leave your house or not. But to me, it still hit me in the same place. So that autonomy of like, I get to choose what I work on, who I work with, the causes that like I, dedicate my time to, the people that I choose to hang out with, how I wear my hair, all of that. So I think those three personally are probably the things that are most important for me.
Yeah, love that. Love that.
And how I frame my decisions. Because I think values are how we choose to make decisions for ourselves. So I think once you hear that, you're like, okay, I can kind of see this now.
Yeah.
I can see how you landed where you're at now, all those things. So
Yeah, that's awesome. Like the authenticity, I feel like it kind of speaks for yourself. And then, yeah, I think the autonomy I resonate with a lot as well because like I feel like in my experience I want to have freedom,
mm-hmm.
and that is because I grew up grew up childhood, adolescence, and like early young adulthood with like restrictions placed on me, right? It's like, hey, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. And people were doing the best they could, and there were consequences on all those people, including myself.
Right.
So, I found freedom to be one of those like things that I now like. That's why I left the corporate world. It's like, hey, I want freedom. I want autonomy to
mm-hmm.
live my own life, to schedule the energy, the people that I want to. And so, like, I think I resonate with autonomy a lot too.
Well, and autonomy is freedom, but also ownership. How many creatives, and this is becoming like culturally, I think we're making a shift here, but like in the decades past, even people like artists, like musical artists, they did not own their work. Labels did. People held their masters, all these different things. A lot of us have never really been able to like have that ownership over what we're creating. And I think for me, it's about that as well, of like owning my work and owning that legacy and being able to own my own story. Again, one thing I learned, I wrote an article recently about the Black queer archives for Kansas City, and typical museums, when you like donate like artifacts to a museum, like a typical one, they own the rights to your story now, which is so bizarre to me. Like when you donate that, you're basically, they get to tell your story and they get to like be the ones to like steward that. And for people who are still living, it's like, especially in the queer community, it's like, our understanding of ourselves evolves, and I think so that's also that aspect of it. It's like, how do you have ownership over your own story and about, your creative work and stuff as well.
Yeah, even with like whatever, like museums or maybe like books.
Mm-hmm.
So I know, there's a lot of talk about like owning your, like the imprint and owning the book, like when you're publishing a book, etc. Like, and right. Whatever format that story comes in, right? So it's kind of weird to hear sometimes. It's like, well, even if you're still living, it's like, hey, actually this library or this museum owns your story.
Or they can sell it to like Vice to make a documentary about stuff that you donated, but like now they're going to go tell a whole narrative documentary potentially about. And when I learned that from Nasir, who's the one who operates that, I was just like, okay, this is something that I did not know before. This is why I wanted to just quickly bring that up. But it's like, but we see it in microcosm, right? With masters, with like, this is going to sound so silly, but the creator of SpongeBob SquarePants was very against anyone doing spin-offs. And as soon as he passed, just a content factory of SpongeBob. Like, again, that's so small, right? Like, we don't think about it in a way of like, well, that's just a kid's cartoon. But it's like, this is, kind of the world that we're living in, you know, of like who gets a say and who gets to tell your story after you're gone.
Yeah, I mean, even
So
now, I think yesterday when was it Rich who mentioned about the student he was working with high school age students for name, image, and likeness.
yes.
So that was pretty cool because like name image, that's like a new concept generally in the
Mm-hmm.
college, athletics, but like that was confined to athletics, and now like yesterday was the first time I heard about like, oh, they're trying to expand that to other
Yes.
fields other than just athletics with arts, I guess music,
Mm-hmm.
like everything, right? Not just
That
athletics.
was fascinating to think about. And again, it's again having that ownership, right, of your name, of your likeness and image, you know, like that is something that there's legal like ramifications with a lot of that, you know, that
Mm-hmm.
I am not an attorney, so I'm not going to really speculate on that. But I think that, you know, especially with the rise of creators and influencers and things like that, of who's a celebrity and who's not, you know, like, you know, back, you know, with the Air Jordans, Michael Jordan, right? Like that's a celebrity, you know, like when you see somebody, you know, drink like at the MMA drinking Monster or whatever, like those are, you know, whatever. But like you and I could potentially 10 years from now potentially be like these, you know, influential or creators. And then you're like, that line blurs. You know, when did like Logan Paul or Jake Paul or any of those guys, you know, become a celebrity, right? Like who's it's so I think that's interesting because you're right, that name, image, likeness is a foreign concept to you and I. How you know what I mean?
Mm.
But that was always something that I think, you know, people in like sports figures, actors, and things like that have always, you know, had somebody making those deals and things. But yeah, it's open. It's kind of open now.
Yeah, it is. It is. What was the journey of authenticity like? And let me add a little context here. Um, I had a previous conversation on the podcast earlier this week, and I sent him my like book draft,
Mm.
and he shared with me right before the recording that like my voice, my written voice
Mm.
in that draft of the book was a little different than my voice when I'm like talking.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, oh, that was really good feedback to know like, hey, like how I write and how I talk are two different things right
Mm.
now, or at least it's focusing on certain aspects of it. And so like that was really good feedback. And then now like hearing you, it's like, hey, like earlier you said that who you show up as on social media and like email newsletters is like who you are now. So like I'd really love to learn about how you feel like you got to where you are now.
Oh, that's a good question. That could be its own book, honestly. When you talk about a
Yeah.
book draft, you're like, well, that's going to be a book. Um, you know, kind of going back to my like core values, a little bit with that. Um, so much of my life, I was, whether it was implicit or it was explicit, there was always a, oh, you can't do that, or oh no, you shouldn't do that. Like right now, you know, I am very proudly, you know, have writer in my identity, but as a kid, I mean, I was in love with writing. Like I learned to read at 3 and I started like writing like things like shortly thereafter. But it was always in my family like, that's nice, but you know, you have to have a day job, you know. And then so it was always like, you know, you can't really do what you enjoy. No one actually gets to do, you know, like that the generational disconnect of no one actually does things they like and, you know, for a living or whatever. And unfortunately, I went to college right around the '08 recession. I don't know if, you know, that's going to date me. I'm 33. I don't mind if people know how old I am. But I I was like going to pursue something I was very passionate in: international relations, political science. That was my original major. But I'm like, ooh, but am I going to get a job in that? Am I going to get a bunch of student loans that I can't pay back? So midway through, I switched to nursing. Which my mom is a nurse, my stepmom is an NP, you know, my uncle is an RN, you know, like I'm very much a medical family. And so I was like, like go for the safe and steady option, and it's really that long road of managing like what people expect from you and being like, but is that really me? And part of that was moving completely to Kansas City and having that isolation where my family weren't there to tell me what I should be doing, which was by design. I literally did that kind of intentionally. But because I had to figure out, I think, who I was outside, like in a vacuum of like without anybody or even college professors or guidance counselors. In fact, you'll maybe laugh at this. I at one point around 19 or 20, I went up to the recruiter office and was going to join the Air Force. Wow. Like I said, that's a whole lot of stories. But I remember getting my ASVAB scores from my high school guidance counselor at the time. And she's like, this is going to be great for you because you need discipline. Isn't that funny? Yeah. She's not wrong. I definitely do need discipline, so, but the way she said it, she's like, basically like, just calling out, you were a hot mess in high school, so maybe they'll straighten you out in the military.
Man, that's funny.
So it was, it's just, I think, giving yourself that opportunity and that space for clarity, right? Of, okay, so if it's not any of those things, right? Like I have not told anybody this, but even in that trajectory, I had a broken engagement and like a year later was married to somebody else. Like very quick, like way too quick, because we did get divorced. I'm not married anymore. But it was like, oh, I need, again, keep checking the things off of the list, like, oh, I got a prestigious job with Cerner, but, like not being around any of my friends or, my friends or my partner at the time, that wasn't very fulfilling, but it kind of opened me up to like, oh, I read The 4-Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss on a plane while traveling for Cerner. And I'm like, I wonder if entrepreneurship's for me. That's like set the seed, but it's like all these different pieces all have to kind of come together to where I am now, of really rediscovering the things that I enjoyed as a kid that I like I roller skate now because that was something that gave me a lot of joy when I was a kid. So part of it is rediscovering, and part of it's just kind of like just charting that new territory and knowing, no, I do not like this. Like a lot of it's just like, man, that made me really miserable, so I'm never going to do that again.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a lot, but that is that's just a piece of that authenticity is, and also knowing that it's all fluid. So I think being non-binary, being gender fluid specifically, where I kind of am masculine and feminine, like, differing, that authenticity is also like that identity of everybody, not just people who are non-binary, but we're all we're all fluid. Mm-hmm. We're all different in different spheres of our lives. That is okay. That is not being inauthentic. That's just, this part of me gets this part of me, like this sphere, where I'm at gets this part of me. And that's not inauthentic. That's just, just allowing things to evolve and to be fluid, and not everything is set. Like, this is how it has to be, or this is who the person that I am, or the identity that I have. Like that is all up for grabs. We're all learning. We're all on a path.
Love that. I resonate with the fluidity aspect of it because, yeah, there's like very masculine sides of me sometimes and very feminine sides of me sometimes. And I think we've conflated masculine and feminine to male and female when it's like actually not. Even in like the Hindu, religion, it's, you have like there's like male gods and female gods, but like there's some forms that are actually, they're combined.
Yeah.
And so it's like the personification, the embodiment that like, hey, there's actually all of this within us. Mm-hmm. And it just happens to be represented at various, physically in different ways and emotionally and mentally in different ways too. And so it's like, yeah, I love the spectrum piece. And it's also, once I've started to kind of take a look at things like in a non-binary way, it's like, oh, this is not yes or no, right? This is not black and white. There's a lot of gray area. There's lots of room for discussion, and it's like, and I've started to really say like, hey, like yes and to a lot of things.
Yes.
The improv world, even though I haven't done any improv, but it's like just saying yes and instead of like no but. Like I think that's a huge shift that I've seen, and like embodying this, like the fluidity and spectrum nature of the world.
Right. And the nuance there, because our culture in our world is full of like binaries and false dichotomies, to be frankly. There really is no binaries, even in nature. It's all spectrums. It's all, you know, like you said, multiple things can be true at once. And I think that is really hard for us because culturally, um, we want the one answer. And that's why I think AI is really, in some ways, even furthering that. Because if you go in and get an AI overview from Google, for example, you're going to get the answer. But like that's not really how anything works, you know? Like the whole point to me of discovery and curiosity is hearing multiple perspectives and getting a spectrum of answers and finding that my answer is a little bit over here, a little bit over there, you know, and really coming up with my own interpretation. Um, and I think that again, there's just not a whole lot of tolerance for that nuance. I think culturally, you know, and that's why short form I think was such a like a soundbite type of culture. I think that hopefully we're going away from that, but I think that like AI I think is like you ask it a question and it gives you an answer and it's like well, for one, those aren't always accurate anyways, right? But also it's just like, you know, what is that going to potentially do to us or the later generations of just expecting there to be there's clear cut stuff happening when it's not true.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I want to take some time right now to do something that I do in these conversations, and I should honestly do a little bit more of, which is integrate, time for integration, which is just like it's kind of sitting around and doing nothing for 30 seconds and a minute. And then at the end of that, I'd love for you to ask me a question. And then we can keep the conversation going from there.
All right.
Yeah. Anything that comes to mind, Max?
Yes, actually, you may have answered this in different ways in the past, but I'm just curious if you could tell the younger version of yourself like one thing, what would that be?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Good question. If I could tell the younger version of me something. So I think there's like the generic but very powerful message of like everything is going to be all right, like that realm uh, of dialogue, like everything's fine, like you're on the right path type of vibes. The other way that I would look at it is whatever you're learning right now are things that you will probably unlearn later. So just like keep learning and be fluid with those like beliefs. Because what may help you right now may not help you later, and vice versa. So it's like, because I've seen a lot, like, growth for me has not been like I'm learning all these things necessarily. Yes, and it's a lot of unlearning from the past, like all these beliefs that I've had, or all these parts of my identity that I thought I had as part of me, or didn't have a part of me that I do now. And it's a lot of unlearning. And so, like, going back into my life and like unpacking all those experiences, whether it's with family, whether it's with friends, whether it's institutions, schooling, whatever it is. So just unlearning a lot of those things. It's just like, hey, just, you're doing the best you can. You're learning a lot, and make sure to, feel free to unlearn a lot of these things too.
It's funny that you say it in that way, because I don't say it particularly often, but I've always characterized like my entire 20s as just a really long unlearning process, especially as somebody who's white, right? There's a lot of stuff like white supremacy culture that again, when you are white, you don't really realize that it's literally all around you. Same thing with like patriarchy, same thing with a lot of, homophobia and things like that. There's so many of those systems that are just invisible that you just take for granted. You don't even think about it. So there's so much, and obviously more personal things as well, right? But like, they're just, my entire 20s was like, if you've, easy mode, right? So video games, the whole 20s is like the tutorial mode, I feel like. And then at 30, I'm like, okay, now I actually feel like I'm able to like exist in the world as who I was supposed to be all along, like again, that discovery process. And I'm like, I wish that I didn't spend all the 20s just figuring out and unfiguring out what was important, or what other people found important. But like, that was the 20s, was just the tutorial mode.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Yeah, because then all the barriers come off, and then you're like, okay. And people probably think that about college, but I don't think college is long enough. And just from a psychological and like medical perspective, our brains are not even fully formed until 25. So like, it's like, okay, you really weren't on your full like development until 25. So that 5 years, 25 to 30, was like, oh, now I have my fully formed functional brain, and now I have to figure out all these things about my own consciousness and my identity and my values and my this, and yeah. So
it's a big period of our life.
Which is why when I turned 30, the 30th year, I like legally changed my name to Max. I got divorced, and lived in a domestic violence shelter for 3 months. I finally earned my bachelor's degree. I went back to school a couple years before that, and like lived, like got my first place, like completely alone, no partners, no roommates, no anything.
That's a lot of change.
And like, yeah. And like had my dad, I think I invited my dad over for the holidays like that year, and came out to him as well. He was the last family member that I came out to. So like, it's the 30th year. I'm like, okay, tutorial mode's off, speed run this shit, okay? Here's adulthood.
Yes.
Comes at you fast.
Love it. Yeah, I mean, honestly, yeah, because I read a book recently called The Defining Decade. And it's about this, like, why your 20s and 30s are like, arguably one of the most important times of your life, because you're like learning or unlearning a lot of those things, and then learning all these like identity-based things about you in this tutorial mode, if you will, and then you're moving on to easy mode, hopefully.
Right.
But I guess, what are some of those things that like that you found out about yourself in your 20s, like in that defining decade, if you will?
So this has almost become a cliche at this point, but the whole like extrovert versus introvert. So I've always known that I'm a friendly extroverted person, But I think that people don't realize, and maybe it's not for everybody, but moving to Kansas City, and we talked a little bit about this, I think, before we went live with recording, but it took me so long to find friends, and that actually had a profound impact on my mental health. That isolation, again, of my family and friends being in Florida, being very far away from them, really only knowing people through work, not really having deep relationships other than like my romantic partnership at the time. Um, it it really made me very, just frankly, unstable mentally. Like I had very low lows, high highs. Um, and I was kind of reacting in almost a survival mode, like with that. So that isolation, and this happened to a lesser extent during the pandemic, but of course I had those deep relationships, and I did, do virtual thing, So I learned at that point, thankfully, after, during a global pandemic, I'm like, I've already kind of understand myself well enough to know how to go about getting that need met. But that like social need, I think people, when you're in college, right, or when you're in high school, you're around everybody all the time, so I don't even think you think about it, right? I don't even think it's conscious that you're getting that social need met, because it's just happening whether you're really having to do it consciously or not. But the once I was out of school, and like I said, once I moved to Kansas City, it was like, oh, this can kill you just like not eating food, right? Like it's really, this is how important socialization and having that social need is met. I would argue Maslow has some things a little backwards, because um, the Maslow's hierarchy
Yeah,
of
yeah.
needs. I just for people who are not, the physical needs, and then the love and belonging and safety and all these different issues. But one of the from a research standpoint, one of the biggest indicators of premature death is social isolation. Um, so it's just kind of that understanding of, okay, that part of me was a big thing that I had to learn about myself, and then being in community actually was what helped me understand my own self identity. So something about just being queer, the LGBTQ community, is because there's some of this language to describe things that have already existed, right? There's been, you talked about that from like even the spiritual religious perspective of there being, like, there's been on androgynous deities and different types of identities throughout all of world history. But oh, you feel this way too? Oh, you're like that. Oh, okay. Like having other people live their lives authentically, again, especially when they have similar feelings to you, of feeling excluded or feeling like, um, people are seeing them as someone they're not, like being seen or perceived as a woman. It's like, oh no, I've been feeling that all along, even since a kid, and I never really were able to put that into words. So from that perspective as well, it's kind of like that socialization helped me reinforce, okay, now I can talk about how I feel inside, because other people have been able to speak their story and to talk about it in a way that resonated with me and made me understand things about myself I didn't know yet. Even with social media, one of the people that I follow on Facebook, and they're a popular trans creator, um, and watching his transmasculine like journey towards self acceptance, because in our popular culture, granted, a lot of it media wise has been drag queens, but like really you only see trans women, right? Like you see Laverne Cox and you see, Caitlyn Jenner. There's not, until Elliot Page recently came out, there's not really a lot of popular representations of people who are in feminine bodies who do not feel like women, right? That story has not been told a lot. Um, and that's why I'm such a big, that's why stories are my life, because stories saved my life, frankly. They made me realize not just my own authentic self, but also stories made me see like my own privileges differently, like hearing from other people how they have interacted with like police or other systems of oppression and things like that. I'm like, oh, I never really thought about it, but until you put it into this perspective with your story, I'm now able to understand differently. So there's so much of that piece of just being in community and hearing people's stories and building that muscle of like understanding the meaning behind it. I think so much of, of information is freely accessible, but it's also, frankly, to me, it's freaking useless without the meaning attached to it, right? Without having some sort of like emotion or a person that I can visualize and really, really respond to. Otherwise, it just kind of just goes, you know, right past us. So
Yeah. Thanks for sharing all that. That's beautiful. I love that. The one thing I wrote down was like the identity through community. I love that. It's because like from what you were sharing and how I resonated with it, like you're finding yourself because there's a lot of like, hey, like especially in your 20s, like work on yourself. Hey, I'm going to work on myself, and the connotation of that I felt and experienced at the time was like, all right, like I got to do it alone.
yeah,
Like
go in your journal, right, or whatever
right.
it is.
And like, and
yeah,
those are good things.
right.
And there's also other ways to find yourself, and that's through being part of a larger group, society, community that you resonate with, and like that process of being part of a community that you didn't resonate with, for example, or not even being a part of a community, like maybe let's say after the college years, that journey of figuring out what communities am I actually a part of and like belong in, and so can socialize in naturally and feel my full authentic self. I think that is like finding that identity through that larger community. That's big, and I've like started to experience a little bit of that this last year, since it's been about a year since I left my full-time job, and it's there's all the aspects of it that made me leave my job, and now looking back, I do miss the like, oh, here was a large goal that like a collective we were aiming towards and achieving, of opening stores, making customers happy, making franchisees happy, like seeing our vans and like everything out on the streets, like doing their job, right? And like the value and the impact of my work and our team's work, seeing that come to fruition. And being a soloist now with my own business, you kind of lose a little bit of that sense of like being part of a larger, like bigger, hairier, audacious goal, if you will, if you've heard that terminology. So I'm kind of curious to hear if that's something that you resonate with and have felt or experienced, and yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting that you did talk about that, because it goes kind of back into those themes of like that, like autonomy versus community, right? Like, and having a little bit of, there's no, like, again, there's a false dichotomy to say that you can't have both of those things. But I think from like a business building perspective, I think that's why for me, I look at creating offerings that do build community, like what can I offer that has that sense of community embedded into it? And then also of that collective success. Like when I see, like we were at an awards ceremony last night for Keystone, and when I see people who I know and am connected with win, it's like I'm winning. Like, like me and Lauren Conaway are like the biggest, like in that room at least, big, like trying to be who can like just celebrate the loudest for the people that that again that we're connected to. So I think it's seeing those wins as they're personal wins, of course, but there's also like that collective celebrating as well. So it's, I think, that part of it. And then also being able to connect your business's big, hairy, audacious goals to your overarching why, and being able to be like, because I think I would argue that most people, again, wanting to live a comfortable lifestyle is one thing, but you don't have to build a business to do that, right? So the people who are out there who are building something bigger than themselves are doing exactly that. There's a bigger why at stake. If it was just about, I want to build a business and scale it up, like Okay, go buy a franchise. You know what I mean? Like seriously, like that blueprint was already made for you, right? Like there's nothing wrong with that. That is, a path. But for folks who are building something that has not existed before, or maybe in the same way, it's like, okay, this goal is more than just me. How am I impacting other people and people I might never work with? I think about that too. Like, how can my content, because I'm again a very content focused um, business, it's like, how can this free content give people who will never work with me momentum towards their desired results, or see the world in a different way that they didn't before? That maybe my story resonated with them, and just seeing it from that perspective, because not everybody has to, like, again, be customers, I think, to really to get that effect. So it'd be great for us if they all did, but that's just not reality. So I see it from that perspective too.
Yeah. One thing I was reminded of as you were sharing that was quick story, and then quick anecdote from yesterday. So story, a few years ago, I was writing. So I was at a food hall called Optimist Hall in Charlotte, and I was like writing in my journal. So it was a great place to like people watch and but like be private, but in a public space, kind of like this. And I was journaling, and this like woman came up to me and she was like, "Hey, are you a writer?" And I said no. And I was like, so then the reason she was curious about that was I realized that she had a published book on Amazon, and so she shared, like, here's the link, here's what I write about, etc. So like, oh, that's pretty cool. And I reflected back on that moment of like, oh, like, why did I say no to am I a writer? Because up until that point, I've been journaling and writing for myself and had a blog, over like 100 posts by that point. But I still didn't feel like I was a writer
Right.
at that point. And so then I looked back and I'm like, well, actually, like now, now from now on, if anyone asks me if I'm a writer, I'm going to say yes. Right. No matter, and I'll, recommend that to anyone, even if they're starting and have like 0 posts or 0 articles or blogs, whatever. Right. Like, hey, like, build that identity. And so to connect that story with yesterday, Craig's wife, Patricia, I want to say, don't want to get the name wrong, but like his entire family was there.
Yes,
right?
I did see that they were.
Yeah,
all
and so like
there
we were
yeah.
seated at the same table, and then when he got his first one of his awards, she asked.
He got 2, right?
Yeah, he got 2. Yeah, like the Wolf one and then the external one too.
Yeah.
And so she asked me, he's like, good. I don't think she ever had come to Keystone, or we never met before at least. And so me and someone else were sitting next to each other, like, oh, like, congrats, like, are you guys a part of this? And I was like, no, like, I'm not really a part of it. And I was like, oh, well, shit.
Well, yeah.
It's like, well, yeah, it was that, I don't know if it's imposter syndrome, but like, I don't think I connected, like, actually I am a part of this. I may not be like a co-resident or like, but I'm, coming to these things and being a part of the community and helping out and providing value, and hopefully, and not hopefully, I am receiving a lot of value. So it's, so like when you were sharing that, that's what came up. Like, wow, like now I'm going to not think about, if someone says, hey, are you a part of this at Keystone or wherever else now? It's like, yeah, I'm a part of it. We have different roles, but I'm a part of it.
It's interesting you talked about that, because I sometimes, because I do some stuff with KC SourceLink, like I've presented it a couple of times, I've gone to like their ESO, the Entrepreneur Support Organization, like programming. And there was a couple of times where I was a board member of an ESO, so it kind of made sense for me to be there. But there's been times where I wasn't no longer on the board, so I was invited anyway. And I even specified, I'm like, I'm not representing any entrepreneur support organization. And, they're like, it's fine. They're like, you do stuff all the time, And it's interesting because, when I would introduce myself at those type of events, or, people would ask me, who I'm with, I'm like, who am I with? Like, I'm like, I'm having identity crisis. Well, I'm with myself for one. I know that. So, but I also do, programming for, Square One and so it's like, you're like, oh, how sometimes do you respond to some stuff like that? You're like, I think, and it's funny because afterwards I'm like, I'm just going to tell people like I'm ecosystem evangelist. Like I'm just, because that's what I do. I just, I'm the brand ambassador for all of you. Okay. Like I will tell people about all of you. Like
that's a good way to put it.
So I'm like, but of course you think about those type of things to say afterwards on the drive home or the next day. You're like, I should have just said that, and then everyone would have been understood.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's like, had my best thoughts after.
Yeah. I don't think that ever stops, does it?
Yeah, no.
Oh gosh, but yeah. I don't even necessarily think it's imposter syndrome, but it's we want to be technically correct instead of the spirit of it. You know what I mean? Like, technically, no, I am not employed by any ESO, or like, technically, no, I am not a co-resident of Keystone. And again, I think it's almost like that. We want a concrete answer all the time. And so when we're asked one, we want to give it. But it's like, it is fluid, right? Are you a part of all of this? The way, that to me is open for interpretation, right? Like, it's not a yes or no, type of, there's room for interpretation with that, right? So it's interesting because you're right. You're like technically in a very technical sense, but
right. Yeah. But it's like, and even what they were mentioning yesterday when Kevin was talking about the expansion plans for Keystone, it's like, yes, there's a residence and like that was phase 1, but then it's like phase 2, it's like all these partners that were there that have, been partners for a while, they just haven't had a space to like integrate into, right? Until this like expansion phase. And so but like setting that culture there for them to come into, rather than like these corporations being able to set the culture and identity. And so we are active members of that culture, of that community, right, of that ecosystem.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're right, because that has already been cultivated, right? Through showing up, and being there and having that collaborative spirit and having those collisions. Because you're right, if they had been there from jump, I don't think that would have transpired and unfolded that way. So it's really speaks well, I think, to Kevin's like vision for the space too, and for really everyone's vision for that space as well. But yeah, it's interesting, to just be like, what is in store? I think one of my favorite parts, I think, about being an entrepreneur and then also being in this ecosystem is just the vision of what's possible. Here in Kansas City, if someone had told me 10 years, I moved here in 2013. If someone had told me, Max, they're going to have the World Cup in Kansas City, I would have laughed. I literally would have laughed. I would have been like, you are out of your mind. Like, this is like, it's a pretty cool city, but it's never going to be on the map. Okay. Or someone would be like, people are going to come from all over to see like Taylor Swift at a Chiefs game. Like, I would have been like, this is all ridiculous, so it's just interesting because the things I never would have imagined are transpiring, just locally. But even with my own like self and my own business, it's like, am I setting my personal sights too low? Like what I like to imagine is possible for myself and for the legacy I'm trying to leave. And so it's like, it kind of all feeds itself, the community vision and what we're all working towards collectively, but also personally. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah, I love that. Love to end on that note. Is there anything else that you'd love that comes to mind or share or comes up before we wrap up?
I will answer this.
Please.
I think one thing I'd tell my younger self, well, there's two things, but it all fits in one sentence, so I'm going to count it. It's a cheat. Like, just take more risks and go to therapy. Those are the two things. Like I said, it's all one sentence, so it counts.
Good. Yes. That's a great message for me, for anyone out there, and a younger self.
So
love that. Yeah. Well, Max, thank you so much for taking the time out, and love this conversation. I'm sure I'm going to look back to this, and there's all these notes that I took right now, not even in the context of like questions to ask, but like just for myself, as if this was like a normal chat. So appreciate all the insights and sharing your story and being authentic, and there's no other way.
Right. Yeah. I love how this unfolded too, because I'm like, I don't even know what we're going to talk about, but it really was it hit a bunch of different places that I think were really, really good to examine. I think that's what people don't realize about it. Like any conversation is, it's really the drawing it out of you. It's always been there. You know, all these stories have always been there, but it's the asking of the questions, the unfolding of the conversation that draws those things out that were there all along. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah. Well, appreciate it. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you everyone for listening and watching to another episode of the Size Eyes podcast in the Casually Profound series. Today's guest, Max Sheffield. Thank you again.